And joining us on this special edition of The Biggest Story tonight, along with Shravan Sen, my colleague, will be Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia. He's the Director for the Centre for Joint Warfare Studies and a former DGMO in the Indian Army. Joining us live on this broadcast, thank you, Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia. Air Marshal P.S. Ahluwalia, former Air Force Commanding-in-Chief, Western and Southern Air Command, joining us live on this broadcast. And Abhijit Singh is also joining us live this evening. He's a Senior Fellow and Head of the Maritime Policy Initiative at the ORF and a former Indian Naval Officer. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on the broadcast. But first, I have some breaking news coming in from Shravan, who's picked up more details of how things went out of control in the Galwan Valley. In fact, yesterday we brought you details even before the official army version of how we were sticking to our ground, asking China to vacate as per the June 6th agreement. Shravan has more details this evening. He has a map with him. He will first explain what happened and with details of also how the escalation happened, the kind of build-up that China had made. Arms and ammunition were stored in some of these tents that the Indian troops also discovered at the Galwan Valley in eastern Ladakh. Shravan Sen joining us first with the details and that map, Shravan, and then let's go across to our panelists and also get their version and their point of view. Shravan, over to you.
Well, in fact, Niranjan, this is undoubtedly a complicated matter given the fact there's heightened tensions that we're essentially looking along the line of control, something that perhaps we saw back in 1975 when 4 of the Assam rifle troopers were essentially ambushed. Let me just try and explain this. I've been able to speak to some of my sources within the Northern Command as well as the Army headquarters to try and piece together what really transpired on the intervening night of 15th and 16th of June. Let me go straight away to this particular map for our viewers to understand where is this area, what's the strategic importance of this particular area. Now, this black line, viewers, what you can see is depicted as the line of actual control. Remember, this has largely been contested, be it from the Indian side or the Chinese side, but here is the point of conflict. The Galwan River, this is demarcated as this blue line, as you can see. What we are given to understand is that a cluster of Chinese camps basically have come up here as we move towards eastwards of the Galwan River. Now, on 6th of June, in fact, when the agreement took place between both the sides, these cluster of camps, we are given to understand, they were discussed. Both sides agreed that these cluster of camps will be removed. Now, that was the agreement between both the sides. Now, what really happened on 15th of June? We're talking about around 4 o'clock, between 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock, when the commanding officer of the Bihar regiment, very important to point out significance of the commanding officer actually going in. He could have sent someone with lower rank to go and perhaps remind the Chinese, but keeping in mind the sensitivity, the sensibility, you had the commanding officer actually going to the Chinese camp and telling them that they need to back off because that's what the agreement was. But what really happened? In the next couple of hours, we are given to understand that Chinese responded by aggression in the manner that there was even stone pelting. In fact, this is what I'm being told, that there was stone pelting that took place where the commanding officer was grievously injured. His men then took him, as he was injured, took him back to the base camp. And thereafter, there was reinforcement that was basically brought in. Major rank officer along with his men went back to this very place, the camp, which is very close, roughly about 8 to 10 kilometers from the patrol point 14 is what we are being told. The major, along with his group of men, went back. That's when even the Chinese, we are being told, Niranjan, had brought in their reinforcement. And in fact, this scuffle continued almost till midnight is what we are being told. And that's how it basically unfolded. Talking about how treacherous this area is. The reason why we're looking at this number of casualties is because as the ridgeline moves up, it is slippery, the gradient is extremely steep. A lot of the soldiers had actually slipped off and fell into the Galwan River. Thereafterwards, trying to retrieve the bodies took a lot of time is what we are given to understand. But it's very, very difficult, Niranjan, just to, give you an understanding, to give our viewers an understanding of the altitude. We are talking about 15,000, 16,000, that's the altitude where this entire scuffle actually took place. So it is certainly not very easy. So our heart goes out to all the brave hearts who've lost their lives, trying to secure our territory. So this is what we have known so far, Niranjan. On this note, perhaps we can also bring in our guests for a better perspective, a better understanding of the way forward. Because baying for blood, beyond that, there is a lot more, because there's a lot more at stake.
Well, you said it right, Shavan. Let me, in fact, go across first. Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia, former DGMO, someone who's dealt with such situations, not to this extent, but of course he's seen. He's a veteran, and he's a very senior officer joining us on this broadcast. General Vinod Bhatia, you heard what Shavan said, talking about the preparedness of the Chinese, and you saw the statements coming from both the army, Ministry of External Affairs. We heard what the Prime Minister said, what the Defence Minister has been saying. Now, it's established now that this was a premeditated attack, the kind of build-up that we've seen. We stood our ground, and we also heard what the Prime Minister said, corresponding with what the External Affairs Minister has said, that things will never be the same again. This will affect bilateral relationships, but on the ground, taking off from where Shavan left off, General Bhatia, I want you to tell our viewers about how tricky the situation is and what India needs to be wary about this evening.
Thank you. There has been a shift in the line of action control at the China border. Till now, these are unsettled, disputed borders, but now they're contested borders. The contest is on from especially starting from the Chinese side, to nibble more and more, to get into our territories more and more. So this is what has changed now. And as also the earlier protocols, the agreements, the conflict-building measures, they have been degraded, they are under stress, the agreements of 93, 96, 2013. So we'll have to see what is to be done on that. We'll have to review our rules of engagement. We'll have to reorient our troops out on the ground. We'll have to create capabilities and capacities to raise the Chinese from a position of relative strength. So there's a lot to be done. And the Prime Minister's statement is categorical on that. He has addressed the nation, reassured the nation that they are under control. He has also told the army that they stand by him, by the armed forces and the army in particular. And he has also addressed the international community by saying that India will safeguard national interests. And last and most important is the signal to China that we will not negotiate anything which is against our territorial integrity and sovereignty. So these are very stern messages and signals which has gone out. And this is a demonstration of political military will, and that has to now the army and the armed forces especially have to now live up to it. And they are doing a professional job. They're doing a great job out there. What has happened is unfortunate, but we'll have to see that in future, such things, if they happen, we are as strong as we always were earlier, and more strong than that, so that we can deter China's aggressive behavior. So the challenge would lie in deterring China's aggressive behavior, as we see what has been seen on 15th of June, or since, I would say, from the 5th of May till now, with the multiple incursions which are more in depth, more in scope, more intensity, the frequency is increased. So we have to create capabilities for that, we have to ensure capacities for that, and that is how I think we'll have to forego that mutual and proportional or mirror deployment, as we call it, and make sure that we have a requisite strength at the point where we want it.
Can I also bring in Air Marshal P.S. Ahluwalia? Air Marshal, how difficult perhaps it's going to be for our military heads to now put together a strategy, given the fact that today China essentially acts like a bully. We have seen what has happened along the line of actual control, but not just that. What is happening in Hong Kong, what is happening in Taiwan, an aggressive China who's basically trying to address its domestic crowd. But how difficult perhaps it's going to be for our military heads to put together a strategy in the backdrop of 15th and 16th June?
I think we have to understand, firstly, the psyche of your adversary. And I think this has been the trait that China has displayed for a long time, starting from 1962. Their idea is to teach India a lesson, like they wish to teach all their neighbors a lesson on and off, which they do. Because remember, their intention is to see that Chinese hegemony, the Huns, Chinese are number one in the world. They're building up economically, they're building up militarily, etc. But coming back to this is a move which should have been identified quite some time ago. because they moved in something like 5,000 troops into no man's land, which was about 8 kilometers. So they've been building a road for many years, and they're coming up to the Galwan River, which is the highest point in that area, overlooking a very strategic road for India, that is Old Belty. Okay, that road is going to be your lifeline to Siachen, etc., etc. So they are going to get an advantage over here. So what have they done? Dokulam, we should have understood, they were going to take some sort of revenge for Dokulam. That is what they tried to do over here. Actually, it was a tactical move to take the high grounds, which they've been doing for quite some time now. It is not that it was an overnight effort. We probably should have been able to recognize this, and we did. However, what happened here was at the tactical level. When you've got troops, facing each other, shoulder to shoulder, head to head, eye to eye, it's bound to happen. Any human beings that are adversaries are put together, shall we say, close to each other, something's going to go wrong. And that is what I feel has gone wrong over here, where people have gone out of control, being in close proximity with each other. And we should have anticipated that, and we do, I'm sure we do the same thing, carrying rods with, barbed wire around it and things like that, pelting stones. But this apparently has gone out of hand at the tactical level. However, we must understand that the Chinese are not tactical thinkers. Whatever they do has a strategic meaning. A good example I can give you is Taiwan. They say that Taiwan is our territory, but they don't want to go to war for it. They just want Taiwan to accept that there is a problem. And then they say, we'll deal with it 100 years later. But that's the psyche of the Chinese people. And we have to understand it. Now, going forward, what do we want to do? We have to be prepared. We have to have a surveillance capability in place. We've got a tremendous army. We've got very, very brave soldiers. The soldiers at the lower levels, the junior officers like in Kargil, displayed exceptional valor, loyalty to the nation. And they will live up to it. It is also for the higher leadership to understand where they play a role, which is most important, having the right kind of information, having the right kind of intelligence, having the right kind of surveillance capability. And that is what we have to develop. And very importantly, I won't carry on speaking, but very importantly, it must be understood that the Chinese, they only respect you if you show force. If you back down and don't look straight into their eyes, they will bully you. And that is what has to be avoided, and we have to speak from a position of strength. And what do I mean by a position of strength? If they've come to the Galwan River, we should have gone into another 3-4 places within that no man's territory over a period of time. So that if they've got an advantage here, well, we've got an advantage somewhere else. And then we could have negotiated, and they would have understood that they can't carry on in this way over and over again. But what is more worrying is Western Ladakh, Aksai Chin, and those areas. And we've got to be on our guard. We've got to keep our eyes open. We've got to keep intelligence surveillance going, and basically equipment not in terms of ammunition and guns, etc. But I would say equipment in terms of ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, so that we are prepared. In this episode, it was obvious that the Chinese, they overwhelmed our forces. We didn't expect that kind of reaction. So obviously we were something like about 100 people. They were something like about 1,000 people, 10 times more. And that is why we have suffered these casualties. But at the same time, the brave soldiers from the army, the brave officers from the army, they put up as much resistance as they could. And I think that has gone home again to the Chinese, that look, you can't get away with it every time. If you try to try to carry out a misadventure to occupy, you might say, Indian territory.
Yeah. And Air Marshal, looking at the kind of tone that India has adopted, and rightfully, I don't know if the Chinese really expected it. Let me get in Abhijit Singh, Senior Fellow and Head of Maritime Policy Initiative at the ORF and a former Indian Navy officer. Abhijit, do you think the Chinese expected the kind of response that they got today politically speaking. Of course, militarily speaking, we are dealing with it at the ground level. But how are you viewing the developments in the course of the last 36 hours and India's response so far?
Right, so I'm just going to start by saying that what's happened over the past 24 hours to 36 hours is truly shocking and really tragic. And in many ways, the worst apprehensions that we had about China and the Chinese character are in some ways coming true. What I sense is a spiral of I think escalation that is building up, even though there has been a disengagement. But if you just go by the statements that have come even from the Chinese side, there was an editorial in the Global Times that said pretty much the same thing that we have been saying, that we don't want to fight, but if we have to fight, we will not shirk away. Which means that the Chinese were probably not expecting India to react in this way, but now that it has, I think the Chinese are not going to, in any ways, in some ways, step back. So I think this is going to. There is going to definitely be an escalation of sorts, and I think it's going to be important for India to, in some ways, have some sort of control over that escalation ladder that might play out in the coming days and weeks. What I would like to point out, however, being a maritime specialist, is that this is a crisis that's not going to be limited. I mean, if this worsens any further, and if the politics and the diplomacy does not sort of kick in and does not control that slide, this is going to be a crisis that's going to play out in multiple domains. And I think one of the domains that we've got to be watching out for is the maritime domain. I think unlike on land, where China in a number of areas, especially on the eastern side, in the eastern sector, where it has an advantage of terrain, it has superior infrastructure, it has superior troop strength. India dominates the sea, and especially India dominates the Eastern Indian Ocean and the Andaman Sea, that critical space through which a lot of Chinese trade and a lot of Chinese energy shipments pass. And the Chinese know it, and which is why they have coined the term the Malacca dilemma, because they know that India overlooks in some ways the Malacca and can choke Chinese trade. So I think China is going to be looking out for the maritime domain. Now, I think it's going to be in our advantage to leverage the maritime space to our advantage. And now I'd like to point out that Marshal Ahluwalia very rightly pointed out that there needs to be greater ISR, surveillance and reconnaissance, and that is exactly what the Indian Navy has been looking to amp up over the past 2 years since it started its mission-based patrols. These patrols were essentially started to keep a track of Chinese warships, Chinese shipping in the area. And it is worth pointing out again that the Chinese have, over a period of time, tried to reduce that tactical disadvantage that they have in the Indian Ocean by getting these spaces like Hampantota, Gwadar in Pakistan, there's other places, Chittagong in Bangladesh. So I think we've got to be looking out for what China does in the maritime domain also, because this, as I said, is not going to be a crisis that's going to be limited to land and perhaps the air, but also it might have a certain implication for what happens at seas. This is an area that we dominate, and we should ensure that we maintain our leverage, our advantage in that space.
Right.
I think we have to be
well,
very
I'll request
clear.
Our guests. Well, Abhijit, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but we're running a little short of time, but we'll slip into a short break. I'll request all my guests, Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia, Air Marshal P.S. Ahluwalia, as well as Abhijit, to stay on. On the other side, we'll continue with our conversation.
Welcome back. You're watching the biggest story tonight. In fact, as we've been broadcasting, there's been very little that's been coming out of the Chinese, government. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the MOFA, there, he deploys their spokesman, or the foreign minister gives, an odd soundbite, where there's a lot of braggadocio, a little bit of saber rattling from their mouthpieces. And that's exactly been the pattern of the Chinese, for the longest time we've known. And the Chinese media, we know, is very scared, Lieutenant General Bhatia. Let me also tell you that, we've been trying to get as much information as possible from our friends, some contacts that we have in China, including journalists. When you try and contact them, they're very scared to give out information. I have some breaking news now coming in. The Chinese mouthpiece has just tweeted, that is the Global Times that we've been talking about, has just tweeted saying, China and India, let me read out the tweet. It says, and I quote, China and India highly complementary in business and trade. Impact can be huge if bilateral relations don't return to normal. Analysts said, predicting bilateral trade might drop 20% this year if situation remains unclear. I think the message has hit home, Lieutenant General Bhatia. Would you agree that the message has hit home? The Ministry of External Affairs, first says that bilateral relations will never be the same again, and then you've had the entire day of protests across India. Somewhere, do you think that message will hit home to China because they have more to lose at this stage?
Absolutely right. They have more to lose at this stage. That's what is there. Economically, they have much more to lose. As it is, China is under pressure, under economic. A lot of companies are moving out of there because of making coronavirus is attributed to them. So China has to understand that India is a major trading partner with $70 billion worth of trade, which will be impacted. They've been, at the Chinese embassy today, there were protests out there. There's a talk of banning Chinese products out here. So the China has to lose in the economic domain. But what India needs to do is, and what the foreign minister has said, that bilateral relations get impacted. So we need to synergize all our domains, be it the diplomatic,
right,
be it the military, be it the informational, be it the economic, and even cultural domain for that matter. So we need to synergize our efforts and make sure that China feels a pinch, it feels the impact, it has to pay the price for its aggressiveness. So and if we don't do that, then we'll back to buy Chinese products tomorrow.
So I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but we are really running short of time. But I would like to thank all our gentlemen who joined on this panel to put this into perspective. Lieutenant General Vinod Bhatia, as well as Air Marshal P.S. Ahluwalia and Abhijit. Thank you very much for putting all this into perspective.